Entity Framework has two ways for you to add constraints to your model. You can use the Fluent API, or you can use data annotations. The Fluent API keeps your model class very clean. You don't have to add any attributes to your model class. You configure everything with a Fluent interface. On the other side, with data annotations, you add attributes to the properties of your model class. But the attributes have an advantage. You can use them for your own validation. In the Friend Organizer application, we will go with data annotations because we can use these data annotations also in the UI project to validate the user input. But now let's switch back to Visual Studio and let me show you both approaches. Let's say we want to set the first name property as a required property and it should have a max length of 50. To add these constraints, I will first show you the Fluent API and then we will use data annotations. To use the Fluent API, I open up my dbContext subclass and I go to the onModelCreating method. In that method, I receive that dbModelBuilder instance. We used it already before to remove the pluralizing table name convention. We also use this model builder to access the Fluent API. So here I write, for example, model builder. I want to grab the entity friend. And on that friend entity, I want to grab the property first name. And I want to define the property as a required property. And I also want to say that this property has a max length of 50. Now we are done. Instead of defining the constraints for the friend entity in this onModelCreating method, you can also define them in a separate class. This is especially useful if you have many entities that you want to configure over the Fluent API. So for example, I can add a class here that I call friend configuration. And I inherit that class from entity type configuration. And I want to configure the type friend. In that class, I just create a constructor. And you can see I have here a property method that I can use. This is exactly the same method that we use here. So I can just cut this code and I paste it into the constructor. Now everything is fine in the friend configuration class. On the model builder, I can access the property configurations and I can just add this new friend configuration to my model builder. Now I have excluded the Fluent API calls from my onModelCreating method and I have them in a separate entity type configuration class. So far to the Fluent API. In the Friend Organizer application, we don't want to use the Fluent API. We use data annotations so that we can use them also in the user interface to do the validation. When you use data annotations, you go to your model class. So let's open up the friend model. On the first name property, I set the required attribute, which is a data annotation. I press Ctrl-Dot, and you see I need to add a reference to System Component Model data annotations. I hit Enter, and now I have also a using in the file that points to the data annotations namespace. Beside the required attribute, there is also an attribute that is called max length, and I can set that one to 50. The max length attribute is used for strings and for arrays. Instead of the max length attribute, you can also use the string length attribute. That one applies to strings only. So I am always using string length if I have a string property. Now I set the string length attribute also on the last name property and on the email property. There are more data annotations around. For example, the key attribute defines the primary key. But as we have named our property ID, Entity Framework detects that property by convention as a primary key. Now we have defined our data annotations and we can update our code first migration that we have here. So let's go again to the Package Manager console and let's call the add migration command again with the same migration name. Now you see we get a message that only the designer code for the migration was rescaffolded. To rescaffold the entire migration, we need to use the force parameter. Let's just look at our migration file. We don't see any change for the properties first name, last name and email. So I call the add migration command again and I apply the force parameter. And now the command finished and you see the migration initial database was rescaffolded and I need to reload the file. Now when I go to the file, you can see that the first name property is now not nullable anymore. And first name, last name and email all have a max length of 50, exactly what we want. Now we can create the database by using this migration. In the previous clips, we have created a friend organizer DB context class, and we have also created a code-first migration. When we enabled the code-first migrations, this configuration class was generated. In the seed method, we are adding or updating some friends to the database. Now we have everything in place to create our database with a friend table. Just go to the Package Manager console and type in the command update database. This command will look for two things. It looks into the default project for code-first migrations. We have selected our data access project, so this is good because this is where we have our initial database code-first migration. Beside looking for the migrations, the update database command also looks for the connection string in the startup project of your solution. But when you look at the solution, we have defined the Friend Organizer UI project as a startup project. So when I run the update database command now, it won't find a connection string because it looks into the Friend Organizer UI project and that app.config file doesn't have one. So it will take a while, but as we are in a video, we can make it faster. And now we get a network-related or instance-specific error while establishing a connection to SQL Server. We know it's not configured in the app.config file. So now we have different options to run our update database command. We could set the data access project as startup project, but we don't want to do this every time. You could also specify a parameter for the update database command. When you type in get help for this command, you get a list of help. And when I scroll up, you can see there is a startup project name parameter that you can specify with this command. But in our case, we need the connection string anyway in the app.config file of the Friend Organizer UI project because we have a fat client and the config file of this project will be used at runtime. So let's just open up the app.config file of the data access project and let's copy that connection string setting that we have written. Now I go to the app.config file of the UI project and I just paste it here after the configuration element. I go back to the Package Manager console and I type in the update database command again. Now it will look into the data access project that is defined as default project for the code-first migrations, and it will look into the startup project for a connection string. The connection string was found and you see, now it worked. The migration initial database has been applied and the seed method was executed. Now we can look at the database. I go to View to open up the Server Explorer. I right-click on Data Connections and I say Add Connection. As I am using the local default instance of SQL Server, I just press a dot as server name. Now I can select a database. And here we see the Friend Organizer database that has been created. I click OK to establish a connection. You see, I'm here on a Thomas PC and we have the Friend Organizer database. I expand this and I go to the tables. Here you see the migration history table that is used by Entity Framework to store the applied code-first migrations. When you look at the data of this table, you can see that it has a migration ID and there is our initial database migration. Now let's open up the friend table. Let's display the data. Here you see we have all the friends that we have specified in the seed method in our configuration class. So the friends have been added to the friend table. Let's also look at the table definition. As you can see, the ID column is not null and it is specified as identity and as primary key. The first name column is also not null like we have defined it on the friend class with a required attribute. Also note the nvarchar 50. With a string length attribute on the friend class, we have defined that length of 50 for the columns first name, last name and email. So all this stuff has been applied to the database. Now as we have our database, we can use the Friend Organizer DB context in the application to load friends from this database. In the previous clips, we have set up Entity Framework Code First in the Data Access project. We have created a DB context subclass and we have added a code first migration to create and seed the database in SQL Server. Now we can use our DB context subclass to access the database. There are many patterns around where you should use your DB context, for example in a repository class that lives in the data access project. In the Friend Organizer application we are pragmatic. We use the DB context in the data service. So let's switch to the Friend Organizer UI project and let's build the Friend data service so that it loads the friends from SQL Server. Let's expand the UI project, and here in the data folder we have our Friend data service. So far we just return friends that we create in memory, and we have here this nice to-do comment that we should load the data from a real database. So I just get rid of this code and I write a using statement here where I create a new Friend Organizer DB context instance. I need a using for Friend Organizer data access. Now inside of this block I say return context friends dot, and you see the friends property is underlined in red. When I hover it, I can see that the type dbset is defined in an assembly that is not referenced. We must add Entity Framework also to our Friend Organizer UI project. So let's right-click the references, let's say Manage NuGet Packages, and let's browse for Entity Framework. I select it and I install it, I confirm the dialog and I accept the license. Now let's close this window again, and let's go back to the Friend data service. The red underline disappeared, and now we can say friends. We don't want to track the entities in the context, and we just call the toList method that we need to add by pressing Ctrl-. It comes from the namespace system link. Now we are actually done. Let's start the application. Here we go, we see our 4 friends that we read from the database. So I can select these friends and I can browse through them. Let's stop the application again and let's look at our Friend data service. Here in the getAll method we call the constructor of the Friend Organizer DB context class. But hey, we have set up dependency injection with AutoFac. We shouldn't call this constructor, instead we should get the Friend Organizer DB context injected into our Friend data service. So let's just add here a constructor, and let's say Friend Organizer DB context. But now the question is, how can I create Friend Organizer DB context instances inside of my Friend data service class by using AutoFac? The answer is simple. We just need to define a func that returns a Friend Organizer DB context. AutoFac will automatically inject this func so that we can create instances of that context. So I just call it context creator. To be able to use the func, I need a using for system. In the constructor, I store the func in the field context creator. I hit Ctrl- to generate this field. Now I can scroll down to the getAll method and I can replace this constructor call by a call to the context creator function. The function will return a Friend Organizer DB context like we have specified it here. But now we have also to register this Friend Organizer DB context in the container of AutoFac. So let's go to our startup folder where we have the bootstrapper where we build up the container. Here we say builder register type, and we want to register the Friend Organizer DB context type. We register it as self. Now having this type in the container has many advantages. So I can define here, for example, if I want to use a single context. In our case, we don't want to use a single context. We want a context to be created every time a context is requested. So when you look at the Friend data service, every time we call that func, a new Friend Organizer DB context is created. Now let's run the application to see if it works. The application works as before, the friends are showing up. Now in the last part of this module, let me show you how you can load the data asynchronous by making this getAll method async.